Welcome. We're happy to have you all today for today's SURF webinar. For those that don't know, the Sustainable Remediation Forum, or SURF, is a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing sustainable practices. The organization includes people from site owners to regulatory agencies, academia, consultants, specialty vendors, and the public. If you are interested in more information on SURF, the handout included in today's presentation has these slides. It has the web address, social network links, etc. So feel free to sign up on our website for the newsletter, or there's contact info for the current board, so you can always feel free to reach out and get more information. The website also includes a lot of great information on white papers, case studies, links to the previous webinars, and much more. So again, sign up for the newsletter. SURF Break newsletter comes out every month, kind of shows what SURF is doing, how to get involved, and all kinds of useful information. And then I would also like to note that the SURF website now has a page dedicated to the 2022 SUSTREM conference that will occur jointly next year with the AHS West Conference in San Diego. So I'll provide additional information after the presentation, but please feel free to check out the website regarding that conference. Okay, so today I'm very pleased to introduce Roy Thun with GHD. He has a presentation on applying a conceptual systems model for sustainable and resilient brownfield redevelopment. Roy has been a very strong advocate for both SURF and then just climate resiliency and sustainability initiatives in general. He's contributed to a number of ASTM standards and ITRC guidance, including the most recent Sustainable Resilient Remediation Guidance, which is now on ITRC's website. So as a reminder, throughout the presentation, the audience will be muted, but feel free to ask questions at any time using the chat function, and Roy will have a Q&A at the end. So with that, it's all yours, Roy.
Great, next slide. Thanks everybody for being here. We won't take a whole hour. This presentation was designed for a much shorter conference, which I gave in the EA Brownfields conference in the UK earlier in the year. But starting out with this slide you see now, the session overview, what I'm going to talk about, some of you may or may not have heard of kind of using holistic systems models for redevelopment or brownfields planning. There'll be a lot of comparisons to the traditional conceptual site models that we're all really used to looking at with respect to brownfields and contamination issues. But mostly what I'm going to be trying to help educate everybody on today is how, by using a holistic systems model, we really can improve the long-term resilience of a brownfields project. And that includes both, as you note in the slide, on-site and off-site longevity risks. And go to the next slide. So the traditional site models, they have challenges, and I'll just highlight a few of them. Many you may already be familiar with. And when it comes to operation, maintenance, and monitoring, can often be inadequate. And some of the reasons for that would be, consultant contract and obligations. They could be limited in terms of what the obligations, requirements are actually of the consultant to deal with residual contamination at a brownfields development. You also have issues associated with financial assurance, right? This could be in the form of, is there a trust or letter of credit or insurance to back up any unforeseen issues associated with contamination or other potential impediments to the longevity of the project. You have unanticipated conditions. Many of us who have been in the environmental industry have come across these, unfortunately. Things like concentrations of contaminants not declining over time. Migration that wasn't anticipated, all of a sudden you have a monitoring well that shows contaminant that had never been there before. And we have contaminant transformation, right? You have things like PCE transforming to TCE or vinyl chloride, or total petroleum hydrocarbons changing into polar metabolites. So all things are complications. Of course, the inset figure there, many of us have seen the classic vapor intrusion concern, which thank goodness, almost every brownfield development, the first thing they think about is vapor intrusion, because nobody wants to have to deal with vapor intrusion after the development's been put in place. And we can't forget land use controls. You know, they have almost always been problematic, and there's a number of reasons for that, mostly associated with the administrative resources and technical capabilities to enforce them. And we're talking about institutional controls, or ICs, and engineering controls, ECs. You can go to the next slide. So what is this holistic systems model? Well, I'm starting out with a very bold statement. I will argue that holistic systems models are designed to be clairvoyant. And what does that mean? Well, unlike a conceptual site model, which focuses very narrowly on contaminants of concern in soil, groundwater, and possibly air, a holistic systems model really takes in all aspects of a project. It takes on what's happening on the site. It takes into consideration what happens off the project or off the development. And so what you see in this kind of planetary view is in the center of the brownfield development. And we go to the outside, I'll come back to the middle in a moment, but you have the community and the stakeholders. Apologize if any of that's cut off on your view. But then you have a few different items I put in here, and there are many more. Energy, rail and freight, communications and internet, water supply, stormwater and wastewater management, solid waste management. All of those items are also critical to the consideration of a brownfield development, both on the short term and on the long term. The long term we'll talk about a little bit more later in the presentation. And then you have in this inner circle, Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, ESG, environmental social governance, insurance and finance. Why are those important? Well, they have dramatic influence on both the financial viability of a project, as well as the supporting companies that are investing in that project. As many of you I'm sure have seen today, ESG is a tremendous lever with respect to corporations and businesses, public entities, that is, because it influences investor behavior. It's basically a way of measuring a corporation, a publicly traded entity's sustainable interests, how they actually are applying what they say they are doing in their corporate sustainability statements. SDGs, of course, many of us, if not all of us, have heard of the UN SDGs, and the applicability goes far and wide, including brownfields developments. We won't get into insurance and finance so much in this presentation, but certainly knowing that those are definitely influencers to both the financial viability and backup should something go wrong that wasn't anticipated. Next slide. So how does the resiliency of an infrastructure project impact brownfield reuse? Well, property reuse is invariably dependent on infrastructure, the first bullet there, right? And we know that. You're not going to have any development outside of pure open space that isn't going to have some sort of infrastructure need. And arguably, even an open space or ecological development still needs access to and from that property, presumably if there's any public access or upkeep required. But infrastructure is not wine. I say that tongue in cheek, but what I really mean by it is infrastructure doesn't get better with age, and thus the analogy with wine. The example you see on your slide is from a dam that was built in the 1800s. This is in the UK. And as you can see, it had a partial failure. 1,500 people downstream of the dam had to be evacuated. Now, why is this important? Well, in standard developments of brownfields, the tendency is to focus on, again, the development itself. You know, what's happening at the site? How do we get all the clearances with respect to contamination or other issues, waste removal, etc. But what is implied in a holistic conceptual systems model is looking beyond the property, because you're thinking about sustainability and longevity of the development, not just the development itself. And when you do that, you start looking beyond the property and thinking about other things that might influence the property's longevity. Now, this isn't to say that any brownfields development shouldn't happen because there may be some marginal or minimal risk associated with something that's occurring, could occur off-site. That's not what I mean at all. What I mean by these conceptual systems model is it's better to know upfront and build into your design considerations what these other risks may be, kind of in the same way we're beginning to more readily accept climate change and extreme weather events as having an influence on any type of asset, whether it's existing or to be built. Next slide. So how does the resiliency of infrastructure impact brownfield reuse? Well, think about this, right? What would the loss of a thoroughfare or clean water or reliable energy mean to property use, right? I mean, those are substantial issues. We take them to granted that, for granted that when you do your redevelopment, that you're going to have access to those things. But what if they're disrupted or interrupted or no longer there for whatever reason? These are how a conceptual system model looks. This is what brings that clairvoyant view into play. And as we think about a development, what are the signs of failure? They're typically there if you look for them, And some examples, right? Storm sewers backing up. This is a chronic issue in the state of Florida, and that's unfortunately due to, in part, to sea level rise, but also in the design of the infrastructure itself. Sinkholes, California, New York, there's been some, places around the country that have been famous for sinkholes opening up and cars and being basically consumed, in some cases buses from this situation. Power outages, which we're well aware of here in my state of California and other parts of the country. But as we think about these developments, we also need to think about future stressors. We designed as engineers and scientists, we design to certain specs, but in a holistic model, we also need to think about the growth that's going to occur around the development and the stressors on the development, both from urban growth, system load, and climate change, extreme weather. These are additional things that a conceptual system model takes into consideration. Next slide. So accounting for the stability of utilities, here's some interesting things to think about. Transitioning away from non-renewable energy. We see it around us, right? Solar or wind, microgrids versus now hydrogen and natural gas. As we move or wean off of fossil fuels or traditional fossil fuels, we're seeing a transition take place where different types of energy is coming into play. And that's going to change the infrastructure, how we get our energy, how we consume our energy, the appliances we use, the way we connect to our vehicles may no longer be in the future gas pumps. It may in fact be only electrical outlets or other forms. So these are things to think about. Groundwater, sustainable groundwater management plans. Certainly here in the dry US West, it's a big issue. States like California, Nevada have already begun adopting sustainable groundwater management. We have here in California Assembly Bill 1668, which basically is now forcing a reduction in consumer use in our homes, and the amount of gallons per water per person per day. It's at 55 gallons per day, and today, and in 2025, it transitions to transition to lower by ultimately by 2030 being down to 50 gallons per day per person. So these are just things that are happening. And by having kind of that antenna out and seeing the landscape beyond the property, we can start thinking about how that might affect the longevity of the development and what changes we may or may not want to make in accordance to that. Communications network shifts. We can see the advertisements every day, right? 5G versus landlines. I know I no longer use a landline in my home. It's either cellular or internet for all my communication needs. and that we see communities that are going to move completely off of landlines as a component of the development. Diversion of waste from landfills. We'll talk more about waste, but certainly every community, as they develop, begins to think more and more about how we can reduce waste. And we only have so much space in our landfills. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that. The two pictures you see on your slide on your right, one is from the company I work for, GHD, a hydrogen plant project in Australia. The other is a cell tower, you know, how as we put up these cell towers to accommodate 5G and other services. Anyway, and we have Starlink. We can't forget that. I was just camping last weekend, and lo and behold, here comes a train of satellites across the sky. I'll leave my opinion as to what I think about that as I'm camping, but the fact of the matter is Starlink is designed to open up the communications realm to more globally, and from an equity standpoint, being able to allow more people access to communication. Next slide. So achieving effective materials reuse. Now, waste repositories, landfills, they're a dying breed. We all know that. They're sources of tremendous greenhouse gases, groundwater pollution, and disease, unfortunately. We're fortunate enough here in the United States that we have good regulations for the most part to address the disease issue, but it's not as fortunate in other countries. The footprint is generally too large. It would take massive amounts of land to support communities' solid waste disposal practices. And the long-term integrity is often uncertain. We put liners, we put covers, we put leachate collection systems, but as history has shown us, those things can be prone to failure, and when they do fail, they create significant impacts to the environment and human health. You know, we're moving more towards a circular land use by necessity. The integration of green materials like biochar, which you see in the photo up above, and waste management systems into development. We have new things like carbon-infused concrete, which is now concrete, if you may or may not know, is generally considered a significant source of greenhouse gas generation, the whole process. But they're now developing concrete that can actually infuse carbon into it and act as basically a sink, if you will. And then there's concern about a carbon tax. And I don't know if it's as much a concern as a reality of motivation to get us to where we need to be. And I'll quote the US Commodity Futures Trading Commission had a report, I think it was last year, and it talked about the climate impacts that may magnify non-climate related vulnerabilities with potentially serious consequences for market stability. And they actually recommended that one of the ways to stabilize this is a carbon tax. And the reason for that is it's basically pushing rather than suggesting that corporations and the public at large adopt more sustainable practices and a lighter carbon footprint. And one of the ways that many economists believe we can get there, as well as sustainability professionals, is by having a carbon tax. Basically, you're taxing those who have a larger carbon footprint, so that those monies can go into improvements of sustainable programs, whether it's biochar, sustainable forests, etc. That's the general concept. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. So as you can see, I told you we would get, this wouldn't take super long, and as promised, we're getting towards the end. I wanted to give you kind of a summary of what this systems model, conceptual system model, is about. When we think about contaminants, I broke it into these three buckets for your thought and consumption. Contamination. When we think about contamination, it's really important to assure yourself that not only the proper remediation technology is in place, but also the means to monitor and manage to completion. The Government Accounting Office here in the United States has already written a scathing report now over a year ago, maybe almost 2 years ago now, on US EPA and our Superfund sites as being significantly vulnerable to extreme weather and climate change. And we must recognize that with any type of property, where there may be residual contamination left in place, and using ICs or engineering controls or ongoing remediation, active remediation or passive, to address that, what could be the vulnerability to climate change or sea level rise or extreme weather events, wildfires, etc. When it comes to infrastructure, again, ask yourself what a loss of key infrastructure would mean if that were a road or rail line, water system, energy, etc. You know, how does that affect the long-term use of that property? And then in a green future, we talked about things like biochar and zero carbon concrete, and there's other things out there. The return on investment for a brownfield is no longer just the sale of the building or the revenue from taxes that comes in. You know, the return on investment has a sustainable piece to it as well. And that's becoming more and more important. We talked about ESG and sustainable development goals. Banks, insurance companies, you know, the financiers, they are looking at sustainability, sustainable investment. And that is where the dividends come into play. In some cases, we're seeing companies and financial institutions saying they're no longer going to invest, BlackRock, for instance. They're not going to invest in unsustainable projects. So these are things that will influence the market going forward and things we should think about today. I'll go to the next slide. I'll give you a few examples to consider. I won't say that these entities necessarily went into these projects with the idea of conceptual systems models, but they are generally good examples of how a conceptual system model approach could be used. And the first one, the city of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, this was actually a GHD project in a small project, but very relevant to today's talk. On Guelph basically transformed a non-engineered disposal facility, if you will, piles of rubbish that were occurring on movement of trash collected or debris and put on city-owned property. And they said, hey, we have a snow management issue constantly in where we live. Let's design a proper snow disposal facility. Many of you who live in colder regions know that the salts that go on road and snow removal actually creates a lot of harm to the environment. So being able to manage that in a more ecologically sensitive and sustainable way is important to these regions especially. And so they did that. They created a location about 4.5 acres that can better manage the snow removal and have an ecologically enhanced area. So cool little project. In Cedar Hill, Texas, the next one, you had an integrated project that really thought about how to address clean energy and open space and waste management and more. And you can look this up online. Cedar Hill is very proud of how this development has evolved, and it fits in with the city's environmental, economic, and social values or sustainability values, if you will. And the last one, Jersey City, very famous project, brownfield redevelopment project, has gotten many awards. This is the Bayfront project. You can see a conceptual drawing on the bottom, but just a fantastic way of looking at how to integrate open space and living space and commercial with sustainable resources into it. So really well done and well thought. And you have entities like the Racer Trust, and some of you may have heard of, that had taken over a lot of the properties in the GM bankruptcy way back when. And Racer is doing a phenomenal job of looking at these redevelopments through a lens of sustainability and long-term longevity. So really cool stuff there. So with that, I think I can go to a thank you and a Q&A, and we'll see if any of you have any questions. Thanks. Next slide after that, please.
All right, thank you, Roy. Yeah, just a reminder, we've had a few questions coming in, but definitely have time for lots of Q&A. Let's get Roy in the hot seat here. But feel free to enter those into the questions tab, and we'll get them to Roy. But I'll get going here. So, kind of first question here, Roy. As an industry, do you think we're too focused on resilience to climate change and extreme weather events? Are we missing the full scope of potential vulnerabilities?
Well, I honestly, Chris, I think we are not there yet. We've already given the examples from EPA with respect to remediation systems and the vulnerabilities there. And unfortunately, many long-term remediation systems in the US were built before climate change was really being considered. So we have a ways to go to optimize and harden those systems to ensure we don't have future problems. And there's plenty of examples I could give where those systems have failed. Remediation systems have failed or partially failed or been threatened to fail. You know, one great example I'll give you that's been well known is Iron Mountain here in California. When the car fire, I think it's a car fire came through there, that system almost was completely burned down. Were it not for the firefighters, US EPA coming out and doing the emergency triage, you would have had millions of gallons of acid mine drainage going down into ecological areas, into the river systems, and just wiping out many things for miles and times to come. So that was a just-in-time situation. With respect to existing infrastructure and assets, I think we're getting better at understanding that. Cities are getting wiser. Requirements are being put in place by FEMA and others to say, hey, we need to have more resilient infrastructure. That is part of the current administration's goal, is to have more resilient and sustainable infrastructure. So I do think we're getting there, maybe moving a little bit slow for my taste, but on our way. Thanks for the question.
Yeah. Thanks. Next question here. Are you suggesting the conceptual systems model replace the traditional CSM?
No, not at all. And I know I've emphasized the CSM a lot. I'm kind of picking on it. The CSM, you know, conceptual site models for addressing contamination serve a hugely important role in getting sites cleaned up and getting developments done and repurposing or reuse of sites. So they absolutely are critical. But as in the ITRC guidance, for which Kyle mentioned earlier, that was part of the sustainable and resilient remediation effort, we're expanding conceptual site models to take in more sustainable viewpoints. So it's no longer looking at traditional CSMs from just the lens of contamination, but more from the lens of sustainability to both the site itself and the surrounding community. And that's really what a holistic systems model is attempting to do. It's trying to integrate all aspects that influence the longevity of a redevelopment. So they go hand in hand. You shouldn't just rely on a conceptual site model in itself. You really need to expand it beyond that, is what I'm saying.
Okay. Yeah. So this one kind of relating to state and federal regulations, but Massachusetts will soon finalize regulations requiring climate change considerations be considered as part of foreseeable future use. Do you anticipate other states or federal regulations and laws requiring resilient remediation as opposed to that being a voluntary adoption?
Yeah, we're already on that path. You know, we see it not just in Massachusetts, which has been a leader, but in New Jersey, in Washington State, California to a certain extent. We are definitely seeing states recognizing that resiliency and sustainability go hand in hand. You really can't have a sustainable remedy that is not resilient to climate change and extreme weather. It just goes against the logic of what sustainability really means if you have to rebuild your remedy due to an extreme weather event or some unforeseen natural disaster. It's just really something that we emphasize in the ITRC guidance, which I would encourage people to look at. I think it's a really good step in trying to gain more understanding of how we integrate resiliency into sustainable remediation efforts.
Yeah, so next question here. This effort seems to require creativity and out-of-the-box thinking. Do you think regulations and pressures for ESG hinder or help this process?
I will absolutely say it helps. ESG has become a huge motivator to publicly traded corporations, and that ESG really is influenced a lot by reputation and risk. So corporations that are making risky decisions with respect to sustainability, with respect to having NOx in terms of how they manage contamination and impacts the environment, are not rating well under the ESG rating scheme. And so having a holistic systems approach really works well for corporations who are concerned about ESG. And basically, almost every corporation now is becoming concerned about ESG because it's influencing board decisions.
Okay. Yeah, so you had mentioned that you recently presented this content at a UK Brownfield audience. How is that received, and can you speak to where the UK Brownfield stands versus the US?
Well, a great question. I thought it was received well. I'm a little bit biased, but the UK and Europe in general, I think because open space is so much more limited, they really do look at their land, whether it's for agricultural purposes or redevelopment, a bit differently than here in the United States. The expectation is much stronger to property reuse, and that property reuse must be not just beneficial to the community, but also have a positive impact on the environment. You're starting to see that spread out, not just in the UK, but throughout Europe, Netherlands, and other countries in Europe as well. And so they're, I think, more attuned and accepting of using this more holistic approach, because longevity of these redevelopments is so much more, I would say so much more important, but is crucial to how they look at the vitality of their communities and the sustainability of the planet and their country. A great question.
Yeah, I think it looks like just one more here. Again, if anybody has any additional questions, please post them. But the last one here, so far the holistic systems approach for brownfield development seems like an obvious way to go. But why do you think it isn't more commonly used?
You know, it's an interesting thing that I've pondered, because when we think about urban management plans that every city does, it's really modeled right after that. When we do urban management plans, you know, those growth plans look at the build out of a city or community and think about what the stressors are and how they're going to meet things like food, water, you know, energy, etc. So we already have a foundational process framework that supports that. It's interesting that it hasn't necessarily that information hasn't necessarily transferred over to brownfields development. And I think part of the reason for that is brownfield development has historically come from a place of thinking about revitalization and contamination and just focusing on those two things. And I don't believe in many cases the developers and the community at large have opened their views beyond just, boy, wouldn't it be great to get this blight, you know, revitalized or help our city in some way. So it's that step of like, wouldn't it be nice just to change this from what it looks like today into something more productive to, well, let's think beyond just making it more productive. Let's think about what it's going to look like over the next 30 or 40 or 50 years. Because otherwise you can potentially find yourself in the exact same position 5-10 years from now as you are today, with having empty stores or dilapidated buildings, etc., contamination. But I think we'll get there. It's something just I don't think people have given a lot of thought to, but I do believe they will.
Okay, yeah. I think with that, I think we'll pass it. I'll pass this off to Kyle to get us closed out for today.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks everybody for your time. And thank you, Roy, for the presentation. What a great discussion topic. Next slide. So again, check out the SURF website find out what's happening with SURF. We're continually trying to update it and post new information. So go there, check it out. Also, in response to one of the questions, SURF does have a YouTube channel where we will post this presentation. Also on that channel, you'll be able to find past presentations. And we are also working on a series of how-to videos for the site-wise CFA tools for environmental footprint assessments. And so there's a couple up there right now, but there will be more coming. Subscribe to our newsletter so you stay in the loop on future webinars. Also, we'd like to note that there is a open call for SURF on June 17th, and it'll be hosted by the board to discuss a variety of topics and issues that we're working on. So please show up, provide your thoughts and opinions on SURF's future, and we'd be happy to see you all there. And then finally, again, a plug for the 7th International Sustainable Remediation Conference, or SUSREM. It'll be hosted with the AEHS conference in the spring. And then, so SUSREM involves SURF, including a number of our international partners, and we are seeking a bunch of abstracts. They're due July 1st, so think of something you or your colleagues are working on, write it up and submit it. And last slide. And as always, a big thank you to our sponsors who allow us to do these types of things. A special shout out to TriHydro. They do a lot of the work behind the scenes in hosting these go-to webinars with their people and their platform. So with that, thank you for your time today, and SURF looks forward to seeing you all back for the next presentation. So have a great day. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.